Okay. Hello everyone, my name is Daniel Backer and welcome to Write Better Stories. Today joining me is Lawrence after a long hiatus, and for some of this video I will be delivering it directly into his face like this. So this is actually how Lawrence learned to talk, was by him having a great interest in the vibrations of words, and so he puts his ear up either to my mouth or when I have a podcast on, he will put his ear up to the speaker on the phone. But in any event, this is not a channel about birds, this is a channel about books. Today we're going to talk about The Crying of Lot 49 by Thomas Pynchon, which is actually my favorite book by him, mostly because it's a merciful 152 pages. Usually anything longer than 300 or 400 pages I have a hard time finishing, but back when I was 20, I set my sights only on the long, crazy, hard, complex postmodern novels, and I read Gravity's Rainbow first because I wanted to see what all the fuss was about. And when I finished it, I was like, I have no idea what that was, but it was cool. And so I wanted to read something shorter by Thomas Pynchon to see if I could get a better grasp on what he was doing. And so I read The Crying of Lot 49, and my reaction was, I don't know what that was, but it was cool. So many years have passed since I have read both of those books, and I've read Gravity's Rainbow a second time since then, and I've read The Crying of Lot 49 3 times now total, and I am happy to say that both of them cohere a little bit more upon second readings, and then upon just having more time go by. My cerebral cortex is supposed to have developed more in that time, so I think that helped. But then in just discussing in online communities like Reddit, and in looking at different resources to try to piece these stories together, they do cohere into something more digestible. So I'm happy to say that it's not just totally like random or chaos, and that's how I heard a lot of postmodern novels described when I was in college, and I really hated this. And it's kind of like how you can judge someone by what they think of Tim and Eric, if they think it's just chaotic and random, or if they think that it actually speaks to a place. Then you can kind of weed out the sort of people that you want to be involved with. But with Thomas Pynchon, it's definitely not random, but if you're not familiar with all of the historical references and with the sort of games that he's playing in his writing, then it can appear that way. And I think that that's a shame because it is very beautiful. And yeah, a lot of his writing is some of the most transcendent stuff that I've ever read. And if you're watching this video, you've probably heard something about that reputation as well. And so I'm going to try to shed some light on The Crying of Lot 49 so that we can appreciate it together, like a big family, not in the same room together. So in general, The Crying of Lot 49 is a story about a woman trying to find meaning. One of the ways that Thomas Pynchon approaches this is by making almost everything in the book a red herring, so that it turns into more of an investigation of the way that we construct meaning, rather than having to decode every little symbol. Now, this is only generally true. There are things in the book that actually do mean things that push the plot forward, but again, it turns into this absolute whirlwind of potential meaning. But for as philosophical as this sounds, categorically, The Crying of Lot 49 is not a piece of philosophy or an essay. It's a work of fiction. So one of the things that make him such a great writer is that he shows his characters going on these journeys that are actually affected by these philosophical ideas, rather than just having the characters serve as like talking pieces for the ideas. Because it's not that the characters are giving these big monologues that are describing the meaning that they're finding or projecting into everything. It's more that he builds this really complex imagery that can be interpreted in so many different ways that at any given point in time, as a reader, we can't totally tell if the character is getting any closer to finding the truth, or if they're just getting farther and farther into the whirlwind of potential meaning and constructed imagery that is meant to basically throw you off of the trail. And that's really what makes a lot of this very fun, because you don't ever have a total idea of what's going on as a reader, and then the characters go on that same exact journey with you. They don't always know what's going on, and a lot of times it sort of destroys them in the process. So as it's investigating the way that we construct meaning, specifically, we're going to look at how it affects Oedipa, and how she is on the margin of society, but also on the margin of the dominant ways of constructing meaning, which we're going to talk all about throughout this video. So basically, this story is about somebody for whom these DWCMs do not apply. So sometimes when people hear that a book is about marginalized identities, they get the idea that it's very sentimental or melodramatic, or it's meant to really pull at your heartstrings and make you feel sorry for them. And especially in The Crying of Lot 49, this could not be farther from the truth. So even though emotions play a dominant role in The Crying of Lot 49, it's definitely not supposed to be a book that's just supposed to make you feel sorry for Oedipa. That is part of it as you empathize with her as a reader, but there is so much more going on than poor Oedipa. One summer afternoon, Mrs. Oedipa Maas had come home from a Tupperware party whose hostess had put perhaps too much kirsch in the fondue to find that she, Oedipa, had been named executor, or she supposed executrix, of the estate of one Pierce Inverarity, a California real estate mogul who had once lost $2 million in his spare time, but still had assets numerous and tangled enough to make the job of sorting it all out more than honorary. There you go. So anybody who says that Thomas Pynchon is too complicated, that's the whole premise laid out just in the first line. So a dominant feature of Thomas Pynchon's writing is giving his characters these names that have this overloaded sense of meaning. Now, in some cases, it could be that these names actually do mean something about the character, but other people have described that when he does this, it's really just a way of putting them in a society where you can't ever have anything without some sort of pre-established way of trying to interpret it. So in this book alone, we've got like Genghis Cohen, Mucho Mas, and there are just numerous examples across his books. And again, it's not always clear if we're supposed to read into these names or if it's just supposed to be another phenomenon in the book that may or may not mean anything. But with a name like Oedipa in a book that has to do with her sorting out a will of this guy who's died, which is sort of a metaphor for inheritance, which is basically what the Oedipus complex is all about, I think we're safe to assume that this has something to do with Oedipa's journey, even if it's not totally clear. So let's talk about it. So there are a lot of different takes on the Oedipus complex, but in general, people think of it as something that's usually meant for men. Now, people have argued in the past that women likewise go through the Oedipus complex in different ways. Some people argue that the Oedipus complex for women has to do with being in love with their father and then seeing their mother as a rival, but then due to breastfeeding and the fact that women are also born in the womb, some people think that it's actually identical to the Oedipus complex for men. So in that case, even a daughter would be in love with her mom and then see her father as a rival in some way. Now, I personally think that the Oedipus complex traditionally describes more of a male psychology, but I just wanted to clear that up, that this is not necessarily a universally accepted interpretation. So, put simply, the idea of the Oedipus complex is the idea that you want to have sex with your mom and kill your father, right? So, this is a really simplistic way of describing something that's way more complex than this, but I think that people like this simplistic definition just because it's so like gross. Really, the Oedipus complex has much more to do with a wound that forms psychologically from being dethroned as a baby who thinks that it's the center of everything. So you go from getting unconditional love from your mother, but then there's competition, which is usually characterized in the role of the father. So your mom also loves the dad, and you as a baby who thinks it's the center of everything are like, hey, why are you loving this man? I deserve all of the love. And that creates a psychological wound. But it doesn't necessarily have to be the father. It could be another sibling. It could be another man that is not your father. It's really just the idea that your mom has a life of her own that has nothing to do with you, and that her sole purpose in life is not just to give you unconditional love. So this competition between you and whatever your mom is loving instead of you comes to represent an authority to a certain extent, and this authority severs the connection of unconditional love that you want from your mother. So in light of that authority, the child ends up repressing their desires so that they don't violate that authority and get punished. So keep in mind that this is just a general summary of the Oedipus complex, but I just wanted to clear that up so that you don't think it's just that you want to have sex with your mom and kill your father. It has much more to do with like a psychological wound. So the Oedipus complex in The Crying of Lot 49 has much more to do with Oedipa's relationship with a symbolic father. Not necessarily a real man, but any expression in society that serves to marginalize her, or define her, or put her in a box, or cut her off from the dominant society. So she doesn't inherit anything from her parents, but she does inherit something, in a way, from Pierce Inverarity, a real estate mogul who is just the definition of the dominant society. He's the 1%, he blew $2 million in his free time, he's a straight white male, you get the idea. So even though he actually doesn't appear in the book because he has died, even though some people argued that maybe he's still alive, his presence dominates the book and permeates the most unexpected places. And you can even argue that he marginalizes Oedipa in her own story. How rude. So in addition to the people and phenomena that Oedipa experiences that serve to marginalize her, we also get this idea that the very concept of interpretation and constructing meaning is another expression of this authoritative father figure in the Oedipus complex. Another way to think about this is that the traditional way of constructing meaning, or the traditional way of interpreting the world, does not account for Oedipa. It severs the connection that Oedipa has with a version of herself that could live in conjunction with that dominant society. So toward the end of the book, a psychologist named Dr. Hilarious ends up losing his mind. "I came," she said, "hoping you could talk me out of a fantasy." "Cherish it," cried Hilarious fiercely. "What else do any of you have? Hold it tightly by its little tentacle. Don't let the Freudians coax it away, or the pharmacist poison it out of you. Whatever it is, hold it dear, for when you lose it, you go over by that much to the others. You begin to cease to be." So in the context of this quote, the fantasy could basically be any construction of meaning that is not accounted for by the male-dominated society. But does that mean that we throw out everything that I just said about the Oedipus complex? Maybe. After all, a good reading of a psychologist losing his mind would be that his worldview is wrong. So maybe his injunction to keep a hold of the fantasy is a call to invest in the phenomenological and the imaginary over the real, or that which can be known through traditional philosophy and scientific rationalism. But again, with Thomas Pynchon, we have to keep in mind that it is designed to resist any one simple interpretation. He is investigating the way that we come up with interpretations and the way that we know the world. And so basically any interpretation that you could take away from the scene is to fall victim to the thing that he is trying to critique. So Pynchon doesn't necessarily just focus on her plight, but he shows that she is forced to use alternative forms of knowing in order to navigate this world that created ways of knowing the world that were not meant for her. So the long paragraph from page 10 to page 12 lays this out pretty specifically in this elaborate metaphor of Oedipa as Rapunzel at the top of a tower. And it's really interesting how much mileage he gets out of this metaphor. It's very complex because it shows Pierce trying to climb her hair up the tower like the traditional tale of Rapunzel, but then it turns out that her hair was a wig. So you can look at that as in he was trying to approach her through these traditional gender roles, but it turns out that they were just constructions. And he ends up like climbing the stairs and then using his credit card to open the door rather than climbing her hair, which is just awesome. So showing Oedipa as Rapunzel at the top of a tower is a very clear image that shows her as a marginalized identity as a woman in a male-dominated world. So she's held captive at the top of a tower and needs to be set free by a daring man who can save her. But I think the most interesting part of this paragraph is when they start talking about a trip that she went on with Pierce to Mexico City, and she starts crying in front of a painting. And so I'll read that part and then we'll interpret it. "In Mexico City, they somehow wandered into an exhibition of paintings by the beautiful Spanish exile Remedios Varo. In the central painting of a triptych titled Bordando el Manto Terrestre were a number of frail girls with heart-shaped faces, huge eyes, spun gold hair, prisoners in the top room of a circular tower, embroidering a kind of tapestry which spilled out the slit windows and into a void, seeking hopelessly to fill the void. For all the other buildings and creatures, all the waves, ships, and forests of the earth were contained in this tapestry, and the tapestry was the world." So I'm going to read a little bit more in a moment, but this is extremely potent so far. So building on this image of Oedipa as Rapunzel at the top of a tower, we now get this historic painting of these women trapped at the top of a tower building a tapestry, and the tapestry contains everything in the surrounding, and he says specifically that the tapestry was the world. And so this is calling our attention to the way in which women that are trapped by their identity and marginalization in society are building up a narrative that is alternative from the narrative of a male-dominated society. And keep in mind that the classic line from Wittgenstein, the postmodern philosopher, is that the world is all that the case is. And so within a postmodern novel, when someone says that something is the world, this can be thought of as synonymous with an account of the world, or a narrative that would try to describe the world. Oedipa, perverse, had stood in front of the painting and cried. No one had noticed. She wore dark green bubble shades. For a moment, she'd wondered if the seal around her sockets were tight enough to allow the tears simply to go on and fill up the entire lens space and never dry. She could carry the sadness of the moment with her that way forever, see the world refracted through those tears, those specific tears, as if indices as yet unfound varied in important ways from cry to cry. So basically, her account of the world that's investigated in the book is not about scientific rationalism or philosophy that the great noblemen of history used to understand the world. It's through crying. And by having the tears fill up her eyes, it's basically as though everything that she sees is refracted through those tears. It's a tears-based epistemology. And even though crying is obviously an expression of pain or sadness or any other abstract negative emotion, it's actually through these tears-coated lenses that Oedipa is able to perceive these shadowy conspiracies. And it's for the same reason that Oedipa perceives her own being trapped as being the product of magic, as opposed to power structures or like a traditionally academic way of describing her marginalized position in society. What really keeps her where she is magic, anonymous and malignant, visited on her from outside and for no reason at all. Having no apparatus except gut fear and female cunning to examine this formless magic, to understand how it works, how to measure its field strength, count its lines of force, she may fall back on superstition or take up a useful hobby like embroidery, or go mad or marry a disc jockey. If the tower is everywhere and the night of deliverance no proof against its magic, what else? So I think that the end of this book is designed to make it so that it's ambiguous as to how Oedipa's journey ends. So she either escapes from this world that's dominated by men, or she's forever marginalized by it. But in either case, since she came up with this alternative way of understanding the world through tears, we wouldn't really know what it would even look like if she did escape. That's what makes this book so incredible, is that he dismantles the total way of interpreting everything to make it so that we don't really know what happens to Oedipa at the end. Another way to think of this is that the dominant narrative or mode of interpretation of society is bogus, but escaping from it is madness, or something that we could never identify. So the last scene in the book involves Oedipa going to an auction where they're going to be doing the crying of Lot 49. And in this case, they are referring to the crying at an auction where the auctioneer is, I believe, auctioning off Pierce's stamp collection. So the final character action of a character in a story is usually a way to look at their resolution or their final perspective on everything that they've learned on their journey. So Oedipa's final character action is that she settled back to await the crying of Lot 49. Now, settling back and awaiting something is not very active. This is just another version of her being marginalized by society. And then keep in mind, too, she came up with this tears-based epistemology. So it's not she settles back and awaits to hear the crying of Oedipa Maas as a marginalized identity. She settles back to hear the crying of Lot 49, the crying of a stamp collection. So the male-dominated mode of interpretation looks at crying as something that would have an economic connotation, as opposed to an emotional one. So maybe she is resigning herself to settle back and await to hear a man come up and give the male-dominated interpretation of society, knowing that she'll always exist on the margin. Or maybe she settles back and awaits because her version of interpreting the world is not something that is this active, male-dominated mode of interpretation. I hope you all enjoyed the video today. I'm going to try to make a lot more of these in quicker succession, and I'm still toying with the format of the channel, so if you have any criticism, constructive, or even devastating, please send it my way, because I just want to make videos that people actually want to watch. So I hope this helps you write better stories.